All right, I think we can just get started with like the introduction and stuff and then have more people roll in. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Awesome. All right, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody from wherever you're joining in all over the globe. We appreciate that you're taking the time off to attend this event. It is Feb 3rd here in the United States, and we're going to be starting a discussion here on a science communication series talk, which we organize every once in 6 months. So I'm sure many of you are here because you are interested in integrating science communication into your careers and graduate school in one or another way. I'm Kshipra Kapoor, a PhD student at Rice University, Texas, and I'm going to be joined by our distinguished speaker, Bob Grant, who will be discussing about utilizing and creating trustworthy journalism, especially in the time of miscommunication. So first, I'm just going to give you guys a couple of rules of engagement since we are having a Zoom platform. So please feel free to use the chat box to have all your questions added in. And you can even use the raise hand feature of the Zoom platform to ask your questions in the second half of the event. And feel free to use the media handles, SNEV Research on Twitter to tag us and ask live questions if you have any. So without any further ado, I want to begin our event by introducing to you Bob Grant, our invited speaker for today. Bob Grant is the editor-in-chief of The Scientist, a media brand that has been delivering news and information to the life sciences researchers for nearly 40 years. Bob started with those scientists as a staff member, as a staff writer in the year 2007. And before joining the team, he worked as a reporter at Audubon and earned his master's degree in science journalism from New York University. In his previous life, he pursued a career in science where he got his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Montana State University and a master's degree in marine biology from the College of Charleston in South Carolina. Without much further ado, I would like to give Bob a very warm welcome. And thank you very much, Bob, for joining us today. We are really excited for the talk. And Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kshipra. And thank you for the invitation to join. I think it's great that I was telling Kshipra before that your group even exists. I think it's awesome that you have the capability to kind of connect across the globe. It's really nice to be here in this kind of setting with a few of you just to talk. And I've planned super formally. I just kind of want to share some of my ideas that I think about often. And I encourage you to interrupt, ask questions, etc.
好，我在学习，请离开吧，谢谢你。
Just again, I would like to repeat as a housekeeping note, if all the participants can please mute themselves, it would be really appreciated.
Okay, I think you can see my screen, right?
Perfect.
Okay. So just a disclaimer before we start. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri. We just got a bunch of snow, which is uncharacteristic. So I have a house full of children and dogs. So this door behind me very well could burst open with a half-naked child running through it, or dogs could bark or whatever. But like I said, this seems like a pretty informal setting for me. So I hope it doesn't offend anyone. So what I want to talk about is just kind of my experience in science journalism and journalism in general, and how the kind of playing field has changed. I've been in journalism for about 15 years. And even in that short time, kind of the rules of engagement have changed a bit, just based on what's been going on in the world. Like, forget about the past couple of years. the disruption and the changes that you know, the pandemic has wrought. Even before then, the wheels were in motion for things to change. So I first just want to go into kind of like setting the scene for how it has traditionally been, at least in the United States. And a lot of this information that I'm about to give you is based on Gallup polls. So the Gallup organization has polled the American public since 1972, I think, just kind of gauging their trust in media. And I want to talk about how the media landscape has changed from 1972 until now, spoiler alert, drastically, and how that has affected people's relationship with how they consume the news, how much they trust the people giving the news. So according to these Gallup polls, between 1972 and 1976, it was pretty high. Trust in mass media was pretty high. 68 to 72% of people queried by this poll said they have a high degree of trust in things like newspapers, television news. Now remember, in 1972, there were 3 television stations in the United States. There was your local newspaper, a few national newspaper, a few national magazines. So it wasn't as diffuse as the media landscape is now. But even by 1997, which is when we started to see the rise of kind of 24-hour cable news and things like that, Gallup noted that trust in media sort of began to drop. So we see it at 53% in 1997, and then since 97, it's averaged at 45%, and it hasn't really gotten above 50% since 2003. And of course, the low point was in 2016 when we had a presidential election where it dropped to 32%, and that's kind of where we sit now. It's kind of fluctuated a bit in the past few years. And right now we're sitting at about 36% in terms of, and again, that's just the percentage of people who were queried in this poll that said they had a great or a fair amount of trust in media. And specifically it's regarding mass media. I just wanted to overlay kind of my entrance into the journalism world. You can see that star is around 2006, 2007. So I've kind of ridden this curve in my career. So as I said, as of last year, late last year, 36% of Americans said that they had that great or fair amount of trust in things that we would call mass media, newspapers, television, radio, news reporting, things like that. And like I said, the media landscape has changed drastically. And to me, it's 2 main things. It's the rise of social media and the role that plays in kind of the news ecosystem, and then the expansion of news outlets to include many more opportunities for professional news gatherers to report the news, in addition to social media, which I see as kind of like amateur news gatherers reporting whatever they consider to be news. And one of the things I want to focus on is social media, and the fact that it really does facilitate the spread of information. So that can be good and bad, as we'll talk about in a second. But one of the drawbacks is that it facilitates the spread of bad information. So mis and or disinformation, which are different things. A lot of people don't appreciate kind of the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. But in my understanding, misinformation can be unintentional, where people are kind of spreading information that's not necessarily adhering to the truth or as close to the truth as we can get. And it's unintentional, whereas disinformation is the intentional spread of bad information. And both of these can be seen on social media and as well as other places, and both of them are problematic, as we'll see. So I don't want this to come off as some kind of old fuddy-duddy saying like, oh, social media, it's ruining everything, because it's really not. I think that when social media first kind of arose in kind of the mid 2000s, people looked at it as transformative, and I think it is. I think that people pointed to the fact that it would lead to this kind of democratization of spreading information, where it wasn't just focused on specific avenues of professional reportage or things like that, television programs, news, radio, newspapers. Rather, it it would and did allow information to spring from many sources across the world, really. Another thing that I think people really look to the media for was giving a voice to people who traditionally didn't have a voice, and this includes underrepresented people in geographic locations where there wasn't necessarily a platform to express their views. So social media did that, and then it had and has the capability to connect people that we've never seen before. So previously, if someone was interested in, say, in extracellular vesicles in Australia, and there was another person in China, and there was another person in Canada, it wasn't necessarily easy for them to connect and share ideas and share thoughts before the rise of social media. Now, and the internet in general. And now it's very much easier, as evidenced by the fact that we're all on this call listening to me yammer on. So those were the hopes for social media. I think that some of the realities were borne out in subsequent years. So as we get into kind of the late 2000s, 2009, 10, 11, we started to see like social media in action and what it really could do. So again, not trying to say that social media is this evil that we all need to avoid. It has been useful. And one of the most clear examples that I can remember was in 2011, sort of during the Arab Spring, and specifically with regard to the protests that took place in Cairo, Egypt, and how those were greatly facilitated by social media. So there was a lot of people tweeting, there was a lot of people organizing on Facebook, to the point that, you had rallies in Cairo where 85,000 people will show up. Probably not possible before the advent of social media. And then you saw the response from the government was, in that period where this was going on, they shut down Facebook, they shut down Twitter within Egypt, because they knew that that was a key tool for people to organize against the regime that was being overthrown at the time. So, and that's just one example. I mean, there's several examples you can point to where things like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook have proved instrumental in connecting people, connecting ideas, so that momentum could be given to different groups and different movements. But as we've been saying, many drawbacks have also materialized. So with the you saw the advent of what people call fake news. So reports or information that is completely unfounded, not based in reality. And that's not to say, I want to be careful to not suggest that this kind of thing didn't exist before, because it certainly did. It's just that social media provides such a unique tool for spreading that type of information. So it's not so much the nature of the information, it's the vehicle, it's the ability and the speed with which it can spread that really changed here. With that, you got, and you can see it today, of course, there's ample opportunity for people to come up with and then subsequently spread conspiracy theories that, again, may or may not be based in reality. Often they're not. You see all sorts of things that may have existed before, but weren't able to spread like they are with the use of social media. And then sort of as a corollary to that ability to connect people, what social media did, and we've seen examples of this recently in the United States with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, it gave people the ability to coordinate and consolidate groups that may have been, kind of loosely organized before, but then to kind of get together. And this becomes it's a good thing when these groups have good intentions and are doing things that are constructive. It becomes a bad thing when it does things like connects hate groups or connects people who have bad intentions. And we've seen this before too. So this all plays into the way that people now consume information. So it's kind of a chicken or egg situation, but I think that as we as a public have become accustomed to the way that social media works, it's really changed our relationship with information. And in a lot of cases, I know many people who regard their news feed on things like Facebook or Twitter as just the news. Like that's just where they go to get information. They kind of scan whatever people are talking about. And in their mind, that's the news. That's equals the quote unquote news that they consume. In addition, media literacy has declined. There's tons of, it seems kind of obvious to say this, but there are statistics to back this up. And specifically, there's a website, there's an organization called Media Literacy Now that tracks this very closely. I think it was, I want to say it was, hold on a second. Last year, I think it was July, they did their most recent survey, and the US ranked 15 out of 44 countries. In front of the US were countries like Canada and Australia. So the US in particular, media literacy has become a problem. And by media literacy, I mean the ability for consumers of news to adequately and effectively assess what the source is, what its credibility is, et cetera. And this is a problem not just of media consumption, but it's a problem of education as well. And I was just looking at an organization called, I think it's the Society of Science Teachers or something like that. I can provide a link to that if you're interested. But they were talking about students and different polls that have been done in students, and it's pretty alarming. Like 90%, 96% of students who were given a website about climate change and told that the people who made that website were also have links to the fossil fuel industry, they couldn't put it together that impacted the credibility of the information they were receiving. They keyed in more on things like the top level kind of organization of the website and the aesthetics of the website. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of increasing media literacy, and it starts with children, frankly, in school, and teaching people those critical thinking skills so that they can adequately assess. And I'm going to talk about how what I'm saying about journalism kind of, in my mind, also applies to science, because it also, you could say that science literacy has also declined. There's people who track this, and there's statistics that bear this out as well. And the same thing applies to, this science that we're seeing is impacted by the researchers' disclosures and what their connections are, or the methodology that they use. And that's probably even in steeper decline, in my opinion, where your average person plucked off the street would not be able to adequately assess, this is good science because of X, Y, and Z, and this is questionable science because of X, Y, and Z. And that's an important skill to have if we're going to in any way make the situation that we're in better in terms of giving people more ammunition to be able to be more conscientious consumers of news and information. So I think another thing that's attended this rise of social media is that kind of an appreciation and a respect for expertise and independence has kind of eroded. And this again applies in science as well as journalism. I don't think people appreciate the importance of someone delivering them news being independent of any interest in that as involves that news, in much the same way that, these days people are more apt to look past, oh, you're a PhD in this field, that doesn't really sway me one way or the other because I'm fed this constant stream of information on my Facebook page, and this is what other people are saying, and why isn't what they're saying and the opinions that they're expressing as valid as yours? So that's another interesting kind of phenomenon that's come about. And the end result is that unfounded information that's not necessarily based in reality, is often given equal weight to well-founded information that's being delivered by someone with authority and with a perspective and credentials that would indicate that they know what they're talking about. And then what happens is that people's consumption of news information ends up being, and this has to do with kind of the algorithms that play in the background as well, that decide what news to deliver you as a social media user or as a user of the internet, and what news not to deliver you. It ends up being an exercise in reinforcing biases rather than questioning biases or avoiding biases, and kind of getting a more fulsome appreciation for issues, in their totality. So what do we do? What do I do as a journalist? What do you guys do as scientists? And the key is really communication to me. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because as we see, especially those of you who might be in the US, there's very much around science, around information, around media, around the press, there's very much a confrontational situation at the moment. So I think it really behooves people in our positions, scientists, journalists, the same might be said of doctors, to adopt a less confrontational posture. So I think that a knee-jerk reaction is to really be dismissive of whatever viewpoint you view as being at the opposite end of the spectrum as your own. And that could be because the opposite of the spectrum, in that part of the spectrum, there are people espousing those viewpoints who don't have a good relationship with reality, let's say, or who don't back up what they say with evidence. And that's a valid thing to kind of shrink away from. But in my opinion, we're at a point, especially in the United States, where we have to kind of turn the tide and change the conversation from "you're wrong" and "I'm right," and this disdain for someone you see as wrong, I think has to change a bit. I think, as ever, this has always been the case, but an argument, an assertion is made more strong the more evidence you can bring to it. And importantly, here's where the communication piece comes in. If you can express that support, that evidence-based support, in a way that's understandable, because we're dealing with a spectrum of people who have a spectrum of capabilities in terms of how they're able to think critically and assess the information they're given. So it's all well and good, and this is something that we see in scientists a lot. We have a lot of scientists write for our publication, write like feature articles and things like that. And as you guys probably know, it's often a chore to get scientists to speak on a level that can be understood and appreciated by a wider swath of people. As Kshipra said in the beginning, we are a magazine for life scientists, but especially in the last couple of years, as the world has kind of seen science as an important thing to read about and learn about, we've seen our audience expand greatly. We've seen people who aren't scientists engage in our articles and try to come to us for a valid source of information. So it really is important, not only that we back up things with evidence, but that we're able to communicate that evidence in an understandable and approachable way. I think this involves compassion, frankly. I think too often, if we don't take a step back and think about why people may have a tenuous relationship with the truth, and what circumstances led to that kind of diversion, then we're not only doing that person a disservice, we're doing the truth a disservice. Because I think the more we can put ourselves in people's shoes and say, why is this person saying things that seem to have no bearing on the truth? Because the reality is, if we kind of think about and embody people's journeys from where they were to where they are, there could be very valid reasons that they're kind of questioning things. Maybe a doctor kind of misled them about a specific diagnosis. I mean, certainly we can point to instances where pharmaceutical companies have done things that aren't exactly above board, right? We can look at science. There's scientists who have behaved badly. We cover it in The Scientist all the time when people manipulate images or engage in kind of misconduct in that way. So I think the more we can break down the poles of, science is kind of sacrosanct and nothing's wrong with it, and I don't trust science at all, neither of those is true, right? Neither of those is true, and neither of those is helpful. The reality is that it's more nuanced, right? There's problems with science, and there's challenges with science, but that doesn't mean that we just blanket stop trusting science, right? So I think the more we can put ourselves in the shoes of the people that we're talking to, the better job we can do of progressing. And this is a special sneak preview. This is a quote from an article that we're going to run, I think, in March in The Scientist that I edited from a guy named Bill Sullivan at Indiana University. He's talking just about this. He's talking about how to engage people, especially who are anti-science. And he makes what I think is a very good point. I think it could be applied to scientists. I think it could be applied to journalists and doctors as well. And he says, we got into science and medicine to help people. And like it or not, that includes those who have turned their back on the establishment. So it's this idea that we take our initial intention. Most journalists I know got into journalism because they want to help the world and help people. I think the same could be said for most scientists that I know, for most doctors that I know. So I would love for us to get away from a situation where it's like, we want to help these people, but these people are beyond help. It's not easy. It can be difficult. And there are definitely lines that can be drawn. So for example, if people are espousing views or sharing information that's dangerous or hateful, I think we can draw lines and say, like, this, I can't even engage with you, because that's too much. But I think there are that gray area is substantive enough that we're missing in a lot of instances an opportunity to communicate with people and share with people in a way that might that might help us progress forward instead of kind of engaging in this constant confrontation. So back when I started journalism school, there was a lot of talk about, especially with regards to like climate change and the fact that, gone are the days where if you write a story about climate change, you have to include that little blurb that says, well, some scientists refute the effects of anthropogenic climate change, and they have data, blah, blah. So what we were saying back then was, you have to look at the relative proportions. So if 99% of scientists say that climate change is real and humans are causing it, and 1% say, I think that it's something else and it's not humans, to write a story that gives those viewpoints equal weight is not reflective of the truth, right? And we run in this today with anti-vaccine sentiment. We write lots of stories about vaccines, obviously, as they've been developed to combat COVID-19 and tested and deployed. We run into this when we talk about animal research. Again, very polar. There are people who say we have to use animals in research. We've been doing it forever. There are instances where there are no substitutes. There are people who say we shouldn't be using animals in any in any way, especially with research to study basic biology, et cetera. So my point is that there was a day when stories that journalists would write would seek to kind of have this balance and kind of shoehorn balance into a story. Whereas now I think we have to look at it in a more nuanced way and say, okay, if the preponderance of evidence is in this corner and there's a tiny little bit, yes, we can reflect that in some way, but we have to use language that indicates that to readers, that says, so it's not just, some people say there's climate change, some people say there's not, you decide. That's kind of a false framework to put readers into. And we appreciate that in journalism more now than we did in perhaps decades past. And for me personally, so this involves seeking viewpoints that move issues forward, like I'm saying. Even polarizing issues, I think if you can do that, it's a more useful goal than just presenting readers with two sides of an issue and having them decide. So in the example of animal research, again, sneak peek into the behind the scenes at The Scientist, we've written quite a bit about animal research. We're a magazine that's basically for life scientists. So if I had to pick a side of this, I would say that we probably pretty squarely come down on the side of like the utility of using animals in research. I'm sure many of you use animals in your research. But we've also covered in the past when, specific, sources for research animals, for example, have run afoul of USDA regulations and they get shut down. We'll cover things like that, mainly because that has an impact on research, and that's kind of where our focus is, to talk about the research enterprise and what impacts it, whether it's funding or publishing or things like this, regulatory issues. But that's not to say that we need to think about this in a polarizing way. So just recently, I've been thinking about, running an opinion from someone as an update, because, not recently, but in the past few years, the EPA has talked about its desire to kind of move away from animal research, to study like environmental toxins and things like that. There's been a lot of work, especially in the UK. I don't know if any of you are in the UK. Developing models that don't involve animals, organoids, or biostatistical computer models, gene networks, things like that, where we can start to move away from using animals research in some instances. So my very smart editorial team, we had a brief chat about this just yesterday, actually, and somebody brought up the point, like, why don't we try to find a researcher who not only is working on this front of like coming up with non-animal models for their research, but someone who's maybe even started to use this stuff, and they can talk about the benefits of what they've been doing or the drawbacks. What are they missing when they moved away from animals and into an organoid or into a microfluidic chip or whatever they're using. So that's an example to me of not trying to adhere to one extreme or the other, but really seeking out a story to tell that kind of is a confluence of these things. And really the main point is that it moves the conversation forward. It doesn't just stick in the kind of like, we can do this or we can't. It moves the conversation forward to a more useful endpoint. And that's what I mean by kind of, really being careful and thoughtful about seeking out which perspectives kind of warrant exploration. Because we, as editors, we get messages all the time from groups that have one agenda or the other. And that it would be easy to say, okay, I'll give you a platform, group who says we should never use animals in research, or a group who says we have to use animals in research. And these people who are advocating for anything else are not of sound mind. That's easy. We could take those and kind of give them a platform, but it's a little more difficult, and you have to be a little more thoughtful to seek out a more substantive and a more constructive viewpoint. And that's I think our obligation as scientists or as science journalists to do that. So I still think that we do have a role in combating misinformation. So interestingly, in the context of this pandemic, there's been so many instances where a viewpoint or a kind of a position that people take is almost viewed as anathema. So obviously, as a publication, The Scientist, we don't have biases per se. I've always said that if we have one bias, it's that we believe in the utility of science and the kind of the fact that science is a useful guide for living, for policy, for everything really, for framing our kind of role in nature and in the universe. So that's our one bias, is that we value science and we think science is a useful kind of guide. So through the pandemic, we've always said, and I've written many editorials about like, let's see what the science says. Let's trust in our, public officials who have been studying this stuff forever and are offering advice about policy or about social behavior or whatever. And then other views have arisen that have been like, seemingly antithetical to that. And it seems like it's polar. And certainly there have been people who have espousing views such as, the vaccines will implant microchips in you or whatever, that are clearly nonsense and could be classed as mis or disinformation. So I still think we have a role as journalists and as scientists to dispel stuff that's obviously incorrect and does not adhere to reality. But I think that we have to keep an open mind. And a useful example of this is with the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how very early on, there were people of various stripes saying, oh, this might have leaked from a lab. There's all these kind of threads where, you know, there's the Canadian scientists working in China, there's the Wuhan lab, and there's, you know, the funding of that lab and the work that they were doing with gain of function and things like that. So we as a publication arrived at a point where we said, okay, we want to follow the science. A lot of scientists were saying, no, this is probably, you know, a zoogenic route. It probably came from an animal. We've seen this happen before, and we covered it. And we covered it well, I think. I think we provided evidence. We talked to people who could provide sound evidence. We looked at all the data and kind of, you know, made decisions about what resonated with us and what seemed to adhere to reality. But there was always this kind of thing where it was like, oh, there's this lab leak hypothesis. And we, you know, we talked to people like Peter Daszak, who's the bat researcher who was tied to the Wuhan lab. And you know, he was a big proponent of saying, like, no, this was probably biogenic in origin. It probably came from a bat. Maybe it was passed on to an intermediate animal. It came about that Peter Daszak, you know, didn't necessarily tell the truth in all instances, and he was engaged in some things that were a little bit suspect. I don't think we've gone to the point where we say, like, yes, like the lab leak hypothesis is true, but we did go back and say, okay, let's take another look at this, as many journalistic outlets did, and investigate and you know, follow the investigations that are going on the federal level and things like that. So that's just an example of where I think we could have very easily just discounted a viewpoint that was, because it was attached to certain individuals and communicated in a way that was more conspiracy theory and less kind of like reality, that we could have just kind of ignored it altogether or treated it with disdain. But I think it's in combating misinformation, oftentimes you have to take it on board and do the due diligence of kind of exploring it fully before you dismiss it. So that's another thing that I think that has changed these days from even when I started in journalism. And I think that's it. So I thank you for your attention. I did include my contact information here. I encourage you, if you guys have any questions or want to chat about anything, to contact me, and I'm happy to take your questions now. And I'm assuming I can provide these slides for everyone, Kshipra, so that they can have them and look at them at their leisure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bob, for this wonderful talk. And definitely this event has been recorded, so it will be posted on our YouTube channel for anyone who's interested to like look back to the slides and go over all our discussion. So we already have questions popping up in our chat box. So the first question is from, or comment is from Olivia. If Olivia, you're still on call, feel free to unmute yourself and lead the discussion here.
Hi, Bob. Yes, nice to meet you. I'm Olivia, from CEO and founder of Rhodium Scientific. And it's interesting that you mentioned moving towards, or the idea of moving towards organs on a chip for more sustainable research. Our company focuses in life science in the space environment, and we are really wanting to move towards that. NIH is put out a lot of calls, and NSF, for organ tissue development on the chips in space, because it's a resource limited environment. And so that's kind of, we're working with Los Alamos National Lab right now to develop a astronaut gut on the chip, because collecting the astronaut samples is cumbersome and we have to maintain privacy, but also the rodents in space, it's also very cumbersome, very expensive type research.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I mean, that's just one context, right? Like there's so many contexts where, you know, you can trade animal experimentation for something that doesn't use animals. I think we're still, it's my viewpoint that we're still in the position of kind of like transition, where it's not exactly clear what the drawbacks and benefits are. I think there's, in different contexts, it's further along than others, certainly. And maybe that's the case with your gut on a chip. But I do think it's very
right. It's very preliminary right now, just because doing the testing in space, it takes a lot of planning and a lot of lead time. But that's where, you know, just because of the resource limited environment, and also, you know, for DoD on the forward theaters of other extreme and resource limited environments to work in those situations, that's kind of where, so the research is sponsored by DoD. But I think it's for keeping the same mentality, how to do more advanced research in a resource limited environment.
Yeah, I'm curious, what are the scientific questions that you're trying to answer about astronauts' guts?
Sure. Well, right now we're thinking, that the gut microbiome is in charge of a lot of what happens all over the body, mentally, inflammation. We're starting to see a rise in latent pathogens that they're not visible on Earth, but they arise when they're in microgravity. And so some of these newcomers are unlatent microbes. They are tied to inflammation. So, yep.
Interesting. Thank you for your question.
Absolutely.
I think we have Daniel who has his hand. Daniel, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I've got two questions. The first one is, how do you see the rise of the podcast format and its role in the spread of misinformation? And then the second question is, what do you see as future threats towards the kind of spread of misinformation? So like blockchain, social media, that type of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Daniel. And I was just talking about this with someone because obviously Joe Rogan is in the news, and his role in kind of misinformation. And it's another example of not the content changing, but the dissemination of the content changing. So people, and here's the thing. I think it's okay for people to have discussions, and I think it's okay for people to be wrong, and for people to explore, like try on different kind of viewpoints, like they might try on new clothes and say, oh, that doesn't fit me, I'm going to take it off. That's fine. That's how we hone our kind of worldview, right? We talk to people, we say, like, we go down blind alleys, we engage in a way of thinking that's not particularly constructive or progressive. And then we dial it back, maybe, depending on who we are. And that's fine. That's been happening forever. In the cafes of Vienna, during the Renaissance or whatever. The problem is now you can do that as someone like Joe Rogan, and 30 million people are listening to you. And those 30 million people, there's a significant portion of them that don't view that as, spying on a conversation where an individual is engaging in this process of potential growth. They see it as news. They see it as, oh, this guy's famous, and I see him, and what he's saying, I'm just going to adopt as my viewpoint because I like him. I think he's funny, whatever. So that I think is where the danger lies. Again, I think it comes down to the consumer. So the fact that those conversations happen with that large of an audience is not necessarily the problem per se. The problem is in the audience. When the listener doesn't have the toolkit to adequately assess, is what he just said true? Is it credible? Is the person he's talking to a credible source of the information that he's spouting? So that's where I think we need to do the most work. I think also there are I don't know if it's regulatory, but there's a filtering process or a framing process that could happen. I think some of that's happening with Spotify coming out and saying, like, they'll provide messages about misinformation, et cetera, et cetera. You've seen this on social media too, where specific posts are tagged and said, this is not solid information, et cetera, or it's even taken down. So I think that needs to happen as well. But I think the bigger issue is the literacy of the consumers of that media. To me, a lot of this, just like any other transformative technology, it's about how we constrain it. It's about how we capture it. It's just like fire. When fire came about, it was like, oh my gosh, this is going to change the way that it changed the course of human evolution, for example, because we were able to cook food and gather new sources of nutrients and process it differently, and that helped the brain evolution, et cetera. But fire also burns things down. So if we just unleash fire without any thought about how we do it or any responsibility for how it's constrained, then it's problematic. But when we can kind of confine it to things like a light bulb or a fireplace, or electricity in a different form, then it becomes very useful and transformative. And I feel the same way about social media, about podcasts, things like that. I think we can get to a point where they serve humanity and they progress us towards the goal of being more humane and being more cohesive and united. But we're certainly not there yet. Now, as far as the next thing down the line, you mentioned blockchain. That's an example of kind of the undercurrent, right? Like, I think that these new forms of disseminating information depend on lifelines of financial support and things like that. And blockchain can provide basically anonymized sources of that financial support. So that's kind of symptomatic of the problem. It can make the problem worse. It could make the problem better. But as far as the next thing to come along, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be a lot more wealthy than I am now. I think for someone to sit, even I remember in 2005-ish, there was a person I went to journalism school with who actually knew Mark Zuckerberg. And they were talking about, oh, there's this Facebook thing. This was before I was on Facebook, this was before a lot of people were on Facebook. And they were kind of like talking about how silly it was and how it was kind of like, you know, sexist in a way. And we were just like, oh, like, I don't think anybody could have foreseen like how transformative it would become. So I would be foolish to sit here today and say, I think this is going to be the next thing, you know. I mean, I don't know, bio Google, where they implant electronics.
Yeah, I've just had a thought of one. Is deepfakes. Like, if you can deepfake Fauci and his voice, that kind of thing. But yeah, I fully agree. Really good talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a case. So deepfakes is an interesting point to bring up, because that's a case where the content is changing. That's not something that existed before. So not only can it be disseminated more widely and more rapidly, but that's something that didn't exist before. Like, we couldn't fake to that level of fidelity, like someone actually saying something in a video. So yeah, that's like a double whammy, really. But again, it comes back to the consumer, right? Because I think there probably are ways where people can detect, or maybe there's technologies that people can use that would detect that sort of tomfoolery. So empowering consumers with not only the mentality and the intellectual tools to think critically, but like actual tools, actual technologies to be able to sift reality from non-reality.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we have another question from DJ. DJ, if you're on call, do you like to go ahead? I think he's not there yet. Okay, moving on to the other question. Sarah, do you want to ask your question? Oh, no mic. Okay. So they don't have mics. So, okay, we can go ahead with DJ's question. It says, very interesting point about balance and privilege certain viewpoints in disclosure. Now, when the issue is much less conclusive at the time a piece is being written, must the journalist take a position, or can those pieces still be written as an open menu of views?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just want to clarify, as a journalist, I don't take positions at all. And as a science journalist, I think there's a certain amount of humility that people in my position have to possess, in that I don't know the ins and outs of every area of science. I don't even know the ins and outs of a particular area of science terribly well. What I do is depend on sources that I trust and respect. You know, and that the same might be said in terms of like how you conduct yourself in the face of a pandemic. If you have the humility to understand that you might not understand how infectious disease works or public health, and kind of do the work necessary to place your trust in someone who's authoritative and respected, then you can follow their advice, right? So as journalists, we don't take positions. What we see our job to do is to reflect, to hold a mirror up, to reflect reality. So if there's a issue and the scientific community is still working it out, what we do is go to people and say, what do you think about this? I respect your opinion. I've talked to you before. I know your research. I know that you're viewed as someone who's solid in the scientific community. What do you think about this? And that's for example, that's what we did in the face of people trying to parse the origins of the pandemic. We went to people and said, what do you think about this? What do you think there's any validity to this lab leak hypothesis? And that's how we kind of formulate the stories that we write, with the goal of reflecting reality, not taking a position and espousing our own points of view on one side or the other, but just reflecting reality. And that's what I was talking about with climate change and that kind of false balance issue. The reality is that the vast majority of scientists believe that climate change is happening and humans are causing it. There may be, I don't even know if there is anymore. This was 10 years ago. There may be some scientists out there who are trying to say that it's not caused by humans, but I think that's pretty much gone. But, so if we're reflecting reality, we don't say, some people say there is and some people say there isn't. We have to reflect it in an accurate way. So more like a menu of views, I guess, but we're not gonna reflect a view that's completely not evidence-based, for example. So I can't think of a particular example right now, but we would never say like, oh, this scientist said this, but this guy on Facebook said this. So, figure it out for yourself. We try to reflect reality, and importantly, evidence-based reality as much as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I was also thinking, because usually media groups are not that homogenous, right? Like, certain groups might support certain political parties, whereas certain groups support certain political parties. So I always think, like, how as scientists we can approach the media to make sure that right information is disseminated irrespective of what political parties is being supported by that particular publication or the media group.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, if someone really calls themselves a journalist, and this is where we get into a little more tricky territory, but if someone calls themselves a journalist, in my mind, they're not affiliated or support a political party in their work as a journalist at all. It should be completely devoid of political leanings or biases. There are people these days who call themselves journalists who obviously have a political agenda and serve people who have a political agenda, and in some cases are funded by people with a political agenda. So you have to be careful of that. But I mean, if it's a respected journalistic outlet and people are putting themselves forward, they shouldn't have any political leanings whatsoever.
Yeah, interesting point, Bob. Cool. So the next question is from Sarah. Sarah says, Bob, great talk. Her question is, do you think scientific publications do enough to make sure good quality research is as widely distributed and accessible? Because fake news these days are widely disseminated through media channels. So if you don't have access to peer-reviewed publications, which are usually very pricey, but the lower quality ones, which usually tend to be easily accessible because of the cost, how do you think we as scientific community could fight this?
Yeah, so you just made me remember that I think I accidentally deleted a slide from my presentation, but one of the things I talk about is, I think one of the antidotes that we can use as journalists to the misinformation that's spread on social media is using social media. So using social media to broadcast accurate information. And hopefully what we're seeing is kind of the agreement on the part of these social media platforms to engage in that process as well, with kind of sifting things out, banning people who engage in information, putting notices on specific posts and things like that. But yes, I mean, I think that
Kshipra, Kapoor.
The dissemination of science through established publishers versus social media is something that is talked about a lot. We just recently ran into about preprints, and we've seen preprints become very important in the kind of pandemic era, where a lot of science journalism outlets report on preprints. Some are more careful than others about indicating to readers that this is a preprint and it has not been peer reviewed. But that's an important thing to consider, because we've seen that some preprints don't pay out, and that they don't eventually get published. And there's statistics that bear this out as well. But yeah, so I think that the dissemination of scientific findings, and in large part, that's what science journalism is, right? It's that link between the findings and the public. So the findings are there, varying degrees of access. Is it open access? Is it something you need a very expensive subscription to be able to read? But that's the job of science journalism, is to draw that link between the findings and the public so that they can access it, first of all, and understand it, which boils down to the how we present that information. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's a constantly evolving phenomenon as well. I think scientific publishers, in some sense, are looking to provide more access to their work. In some cases, they're not. I mean, you have the people that started things like bioRxiv and medRxiv. I think they mostly have good intentions. But there can probably be some programmatic things that are done to help people sift, or at least properly contextualize what they're getting when they get results in a preprint. But yeah, so that's another landscape that's constantly evolving that we didn't even talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I do agree that with the pandemic, the usage of preprints was skyrocketing, definitely. Yeah. Okay, so we are almost on time, but I would selfishly like to ask one question, Bob, if it's okay for you to go beyond 11 o'clock, like a couple of more minutes extra.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah, so as is like usually, do you have any tips on creating good headlines? Because usually what happens is I personally tend to judge an article or a post by its headline. So we know there are multiple like grammar checking tools, but do you have any suggestions, or there are any tools that basically focus on making reader-friendly headlines and that could be used by graduate students?
Yeah, headlines are tricky, and in some, not at the Scientist because we're a pretty small staff, but some more established news outlets have people who are at least part of their job is solely focused on writing headlines. And often, if you read a story in the New York Times or something like that, the writer, the reporter who wrote that story will not have written the headline. That will have come from an editor or something like that. I'm not aware of any tools, but it is a craft. The writing of headlines is definitely a craft, and I think the goal and the trick to it is being brief enough so that someone can kind of engage with that headline in almost an instantaneous way, but being at the same time informative enough where people can get the gist of what they're going to invest in terms of their time reading it just from that headline. So we have things called headlines and decks. So the headline is the main headline, and then the deck is the kind of subhead. So there's some interplay there as well, where the kind of main news is expressed in the headline, and then kind of some of the subtleties can put into a little bit longer, what we call a deck or a subheadline. But yeah, the art is being accurate, informative, but also engaging, because you want people to see a headline and at the same time be informed of what they might get themselves into reading that story, but intrigued because they don't know the whole story. Do you know what I mean? So that's where the kind of the subtle art of it comes in, because you want people to be intrigued enough to actually read the story. You don't want to give a headline that just tells the whole thing and then people can move on, but you want to be accurate and informative enough where if they read that, they'll have a good sense of what they're getting themselves into, So I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer from the perspective of like giving you the tools that you need, but it is kind of a tricky craft in that way.
Yeah, no, that definitely, like, I also struggle with like having a doc title or anything. So yeah, I'm always curious what like editors and journalists usually use.
Yeah, and we have at the Scientist, we have limits. And I can't remember what it is. I think it's 44 characters or something like that. Like we keep our headlines brief enough where they can where they can fulfill that goal of being punchy and interesting, but informative at the same time. And it's a challenge. Sometimes it's very hard to do. Sometimes it's easier, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would definitely say for the purposes of like a grad student in science, you should probably stay away, because there's some people who write headlines that are, you know, kind of, I don't want to say flippant, but like, you know, like a pun or like kind of like, you know, a catchy kind of phrase. I would probably stick more towards like the informative end, like tell people what this story is about, you know, basically in a brief way, instead of, you know, trying to come up with a pun or kind of making it catchy in that way. Like be informative, you know, I would say for your purposes.
Yeah, definitely, Bob. Thank you for those tips. And we are definitely above 11 a.m. CST. So I think it's time we wrap up. Again, thank you very much, Bob, for your acceptance and taking your time off to present in one of the SNEV science communication talks. It was really a great event and a talk, and we really enjoyed it. So on behalf of all the SNEV executive committee members, I would again thank you. And if you have any final piece of advice you would like to share, you can do that.
No, that's it. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it and I enjoyed the questions. As far as advice goes, I would really hope that something that came across in my talk was that I really think we're in a position where we can, as scientists and as journalists and as physicians, we can start to try and unite people. Because I think in a lot of instances, not just in this country, but in many others, there's a lot of division, perhaps more than we've seen in quite a while. So I'm hoping that we can use our intelligence and our careful consideration to help unite people, as opposed to kind of contributing to the divisions that we see. That's my hope as a human being and as a journalist as well.
Definitely, like that's okay, Bob. Thank you very much again. And yeah, also the recording would be available on YouTube. So as soon as that goes live, I would let you know.
Okay, that sounds good. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that. Anybody can contact me via those contacts.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice day.
You too.